Palestine event, Ben White on Israel and Palestine. So the Palestinian-Israeli issue is oftentimes misconstrued by sources that illustrate the conflict. And so tonight we have with us writer, researcher, and freelance journalist Ben White, who will denote the true nature of Israel's history and colonization of Palestine. Ben White is a very outspoken activist and has been to Palestine a multitude of times. He's also the author of Israeli Apartheid, A Beginner's Guide, and Palestinians in Israel, Segregation, Democracy, and Discrimination. His work has been praised by Desmond Tutu, John Pilger, Ali Abu Nima, and Ilan Ape, and many others. Ben White has been published by Al Jazeera, The Guardian, New Statesman, Christian Science Monitor, and many others as well. So Ben White is with us today to shed light upon Israeli policies and that has subdued Palestinian rights since Israel's colonization of Palestine, and to present the true colors of Israeli governance in the shadow of its bold claim of bringing democracy to the Middle East. And so it is truly an honor and a pleasure to welcome Ben White to the stage.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for being hosted here at UC Irvine, where I've been a couple of times before. And it's really nice to be back and also to see some familiar faces as well here. This is the second talk that I've done. Yes, I've got to remember, even though it's only one so far. I'll be doing 13 talks in the US and Canada on democracy, and it's great to be at UC Irvine campus. There's going to be a chance for a Q&A afterwards, so stuff that you want to talk about. Can everyone hear me as well, by the way, like at the back of the table? Yeah. Like stuff that I don't raise or that you want to go back to, obviously please just remember that for the question time afterwards. So the title that I'm using tonight is Israel Apartheid, Not Democracy, and this is the outline that I'm going to be going through. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept or the framework of apartheid as it applies to Israeli policies, and looking about what people mean and don't mean when they're using that as a way of looking at the situation. Secondly, I'll just say a little bit and unpack a little bit about the quote-unquote Jewish and democratic definition that Israel gives itself, and the ways in which that is problematic from the Palestinian point of view. Thirdly, and the bulk of the presentation, it will be giving examples about what Israeli policies have meant for Palestinians for over 60 years, dividing that into how that affects Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, and also Palestinians who are in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And then the fourth section, which is called Rethink to Reimagine, is basically trying to wrap up what I've spoken about up to that point with a kind of theoretical framework. That's a good idea. As a way of looking at the whole situation. Okay, so provide some ideas for how we might be looking at the whole situation. So I hope that makes sense. It's not a new thing to be talking about Israel in terms of apartheid. That's been going on for some decades now in academic papers or books. But it has become more popular, or it's become more commonplace in more recent years. And obviously in the US, we had the example of Jimmy Carter's book, which introduced the word apartheid in the context of Israel in the mainstream, maybe for some people for the first time. But for some people, it's still a controversial or problematic word to use in the context of Israel, maybe because they think it's inaccurate or unhelpful or whatever. So I just wanted to say a couple of quick things to help clarify maybe some people's doubts about what people are talking about in terms of Israeli apartheid. The first thing to make clear is that when you talk about Israeli apartheid, you're not talking about a precise equivalence with what happened in South Africa, historically speaking. Now obviously apartheid comes from, the word itself comes from the South African context, meaning separation in Afrikaans, but it has come to have a meaning that owes something to, but is independent of, what happened in South Africa. And just to give you an idea of why that is the case, apartheid became part of international treaties and international law in a way that means it can be taken and you can sort of apply it to another situation and say, is that happening in this particular country or this territory? It is, in the words of John Dugard, who's a South African legal scholar who wrote the foreword to my first book, and he actually just came out with a quite detailed academic paper looking at apartheid from a legal perspective. So I recommend you try and find that. I can't remember, it's like the European Journal of Law or something like that. In his words, what you're looking at is happening in Palestine today is Israel's own version of a system that has been universally condemned. And without going into all of these in detail, these are places where you can find apartheid condemned and outlawed within the context of these treaties and agreements, including most recently in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. I just add, by the way, also at this point, the very last slide has got my website where there is an email contact form. So if anybody wants to get the presentation afterwards for the references, etc., feel free to do that. Also, what's happened in recent years is that some think tanks and scholars have also taken it upon themselves to produce scholarly analyses of what's going on in Palestine in terms of apartheid. This is one example. It is a good reference point, which was done by a South African think tank called the Human Sciences Research Council. And their 2009 study, which exclusively looked at the West Bank and Gaza Strip only, from the context of what is going on here as occupation, colonialism, and apartheid. The final example I wanted to give when looking at Israel in terms of apartheid references a really important report that I recommend anybody who's interested in this issue go and find. It wasn't a big headline-grabbing report like Goldstone or something like that, but for me it's equally important actually in terms of describing what is going on there. It was the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination's report on Israel. That committee periodically reviews every country who is a signatory to the convention, which Israel amusingly is. And at this most recent review, which the Israeli state submits its sort of evidence to, and NGOs submit their evidence to, the committee's language about Israel was unprecedented in terms of how harsh it was about Israeli policies. And just give you an example, they talked about, quote, segregation between Jewish and non-Jewish communities and a lack of equal access to land and property inside the pre-67 borders, right? Inside good Israel, not talking about the West Bank there. And then in addition, when they looked at the West Bank, they talked about a regime of, quote, de facto segregation, severe enough to prompt the committee to remind the state party, to remind Israel, of the prohibition of apartheid within international law. And that was the first time that that committee had used the term apartheid in a country's review since the time of South Africa. So it's a very interesting report that I recommend you kind of go and look up because it goes into quite a lot of detail about the ways in which Israel is conducting policies that are systematically discriminatory. So I want to move on now to look at this definition of Israel as quote-unquote Jewish and democratic, which is the definition Israel gives itself. And actually the starting point for understanding the tensions and the contradictions within that definition for the state of Israel is the ethnic cleansing of Palestine that took place in 1948. The Nakba, or the catastrophe, saw around 90% of all the Palestinians who would have been inside what then became the State of Israel expelled and prevented from returning home. And that is the sort of beginning point for understanding the way in which Israel's identity as a Jewish state presents big problems for the Palestinian people. Because, now here's the crucial thing, there's only a Jewish majority in Israel today because of the ethnic cleansing that took place in 48. Okay, that's the only reason there is the Jewish majority, which the state seeks to protect and defend, because of the expulsions of the Palestinians that took place. Now, straight after, or a couple of years following the State of Israel's establishment, key laws were passed by the Knesset that were effectively defining the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. And these are three key laws that were part of setting up Israel's ethnocratic structure. You've got the absentee property law, the law of return, and the citizenship law. And what those three laws were doing, like as individually and as a combination, they were saying that the property of expelled Palestinian refugees is now being looked after by the state. It was saying that any Jew around the world can move to Israel to become a citizen. And it was stripping the expelled Palestinians of the right to be a citizen in the new state. So Palestinian refugees are out, their property is part of the state, and meanwhile, any Jew in the world can emigrate and become a citizen. So that was the three key laws that were set up in those first 2 years that were setting up Israel not as a democracy, but as more of a technocracy. Here's another way of looking at it. Here's a different angle. Israel doesn't have a formal constitution, but instead it has these basic laws that are used to kind of define key aspects of the nature of how the state functions with the army and elections and the Knesset and stuff like this. One of the basic laws is instructive for looking at the tension between Israel's Jewish and democratic identity, and that is basic law, human dignity and liberty. Now, if you look at the law, this particular basic law, its title, how it's written, it looks like that it is actually protecting the rights of the minorities within the state. But there is a key section of that basic law, a key clause, that you will notice like flags up a big problem. So this is part of the basic law. It says there shall be no violation of rights under this basic law except by a law befitting the values of the state of Israel, enacted for a proper purpose and to an extent no greater than is required. Okay, so what are the values of the state of Israel that it's talking about? The values of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. So what that means in practice, and this has been referenced by Israel's High Court on certain rulings, what it means is that where there is the need to protect Israel's identity as a Jewish state, that is allowed to trump or ride over the rights of minorities that might otherwise be protected within this law. Here's another way of looking at it. Ariel Sharon, obviously famous former prime minister, he talked about how Arabs have, quote, rights in the land, the italics are my emphasis, but all rights over the land of Israel are Jewish rights. You look at the key difference there, which is not just semantics, it's an important difference that he's making there. What he's saying is that, okay, there's Arabs here, whether we like it or not, and basically we don't, and they have some rights that are conditional. But actually, who has the rights to the land itself, according to Sharon's idea here, are the Jewish people per se. Okay? I'm making a contrast between those who are in the land and have got conditional rights, and those to whom the land apparently belongs. Ruth Gavison, an Israeli legal scholar, she wrote an essay a few years ago, I think it's about 10 years ago now, defending Israel as a Jewish state. Okay, so the essay was written as a defense of Israel as a Jewish state. But as she did so, she was honest in a way that some people are not about what that means for Palestinians. And she wrote words like this: the Jewish state is thus an enterprise in which the Arabs are not equal partners. Okay, remember, she's not talking about Arabs in like Amman or Lebanon. She's talking about Arabs, Palestinians who have got Israeli citizenship. And she went on to talk about what that means. The needs of Jewish nationalism, Ruth Gavison wrote, justify certain restrictions on the Arab population in Israel, particularly in areas such as security, land distribution, population dispersal, and education. Okay, so it's not just a matter of feelings. It's not just that Palestinian citizens can't sing along with the national anthem or identify with the flag. It's actually material discrimination that affects their lives on a sort of daily basis. And that's going to be a big chunk of what I'm about to talk about now, giving these examples of what that means in practice. So I'm starting off with Palestinian citizens of Israel, which are Palestinians, about 20% of Israel's population, those who were left behind and their descendants, when most of the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 48. And the context, of course, for their relationship to the state, to the Israeli state, is this history of mass land confiscation, okay, that took place in 48, but then continued onwards too. Here's just to give you an idea of the scale of what took place. Okay, so from 48 to 1953, that's the first 5 years of the state's existence, 95%, so almost all, of the new Jewish communities that Israel established in that first 5-year period were all built on the property of expelled Palestinians. By 1950, 2 years into the state's existence, cooperative settlements, the kibbutzim, the moshavim, held almost half of all the abandoned Palestinian land. And by the mid-70s, so 30 years on, the average Palestinian community in Israel, remember, not talking about the West Bank or Gaza Strip, but talking about inside the pre-67 area, by the mid-70s, the average Palestinian community there had lost between 2/3 and 3/4 of that village or town's land. Okay? And you can imagine, obviously, the impact that that has on a community in terms of its ability to sort of naturally grow, economically thrive, etc., etc. And in addition to all of that, 1 in 4 of the Palestinian citizens of Israel are so-called present absentees, which means they're actually refugees, even though they have Israeli citizenship. And why that happened was that because whereas most of the Palestinians who were expelled from their villages ended up the wrong side of the new border, so the wrong outside of what became Israel, some of them were displaced from one village that was destroyed to another village that ended up also inside Israel. So effectively they became internally displaced persons. They received Israeli citizenship, but because they are Palestinian and not Jewish, they haven't been able to go back or have their lands restored to them, even though they're inside the state with citizenship. Okay, so those families are minutes away sometimes from even their physical home, that's in some cases still standing, or from their village's land. But it can't be returned to them because of the way the legislation has worked. That is a picture from 2008, and every year when the State of Israel officially marks Independence Day, Palestinians are marking Catastrophe Day, Nakba Day, remembering the ethnic cleansing that took place. And in what they tend to do is they go on a march to the site of a destroyed village. And in this case, it's going to Sefuria outside Nazareth. And they're holding signs up with the names of destroyed villages on them. Now, how that is also related to another aspect of Israeli policies towards the Palestinian minority inside the state is this idea of quote-unquote Judaization, which is not a word that I've just made up, but is actually the term that has been used by Israeli governments and local authorities to refer to the idea that in some areas of the state, and normally that has meant the Galilee in the north and the Negev in the south, it's perceived that there are too many non-Jews, too many Palestinians, in relation to Jewish citizens. And therefore the idea is to implement policies that will change that demographic relationship in those two areas. Here's an example of what that has meant in practice. In the late 70s and the early 80s, the Israeli government, working alongside a group, the Jewish Agency, created these communities in the Galilee called Mitzpim, which literally mean lookout communities. You see this kind of militaristic language deployed a lot within planning and spatial arrangements, with a very similar kind of idea in mind as to what's taking place in the West Bank with settlements. Placing these communities on the hilltops in the Galilee in order to, in the words of the Jewish Agency planner involved, keep Arab villages from attaining territorial continuity. How about this from the then housing minister in 2009, a few years ago? He said it was, quote, a national duty to prevent the spread of Palestinian citizens. And he was talking then specifically about the area of the Galilee. Imagine a politician, like wherever you live, using that kind of language about a minority group. Would you characterize that individual or the government of which he is part as progressive, as forward-thinking, or would you perhaps associate them with the far right? But this is in fact the language and the policies that are characteristic of Israeli governments since 1948, without exception. What about this from Ehud Olmert in 1998, speaking then as the mayor of Jerusalem, who obviously then went on to become prime minister later? He said it was a matter of concern when the non-Jewish population rises a lot faster than the Jewish population. Speaking as the elected mayor of what Israel claims is its capital city, those are like words that he said in secret. He didn't get fired the next day or face a massive public outcry for that kind of language. That's because the discussion of the so-called demographic threat is commonplace amongst Israeli politicians, academics, opinion column writers, etc., that see the Palestinian citizens as being a threat simply because they are Palestinian. Here's another aspect which has actually started to get more attention, although depressingly it's getting more attention precisely because the situation has become more dire. And that is that there are tens of thousands of Bedouin Palestinian citizens, particularly in the Negev, but not exclusively in the Negev, who live in what are referred to as unrecognized villages. And that means that these communities are not recognized officially by the state as being there. They're not on the map, and therefore they face severe problems, or it's impossible for them to connect to basic infrastructure. And the reason why they exist as unrecognized villages is because going back some decades now, when the Israeli state started to formally plan space within the state